As the bloody battle for the Pacific comes to an end, there is one forgotten attack that defied all the odds. An outdated Japanese biplane made of wood and fabric that somehow sunk a powerful US destroyer. So, how did this happen? Many of you guys have asked me, what software do I use to make these videos? Well, it's actually the sponsor of this video, War Thunder. If you haven't tried it before, War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, with more than 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships to use in dynamic and multiplayer battles. Each vehicle is incredibly detailed and modeled down to their individual components, creating a highly immersive combat experience. And best of all, War Thunder is totally free to play and is available on PC, PlayStation 5, or Xbox Series X and S, as well as the previous console generation. One of my favorite features is their vehicle customization, which allows me to use all sorts of camos and nose art in my videos. If this looks like something for you, right after this video, download War Thunder for free at the link below and get a huge free bonus pack with premium vehicles, account, and much more. You can even add me as a friend and help fly as an extra in one of my historical videos. Thanks again to War Thunder, and now enjoy. The year is 1945, and the Battle of Okinawa has been raging for months. The United States has claimed the victory, but at no small cost, as more than 12,000 American service members have given their lives for this small stretch of land south of mainland Japan. In this famous battle, the Japanese have notably turned to an infamous tactic to try and put up a final stand against the attacking forces. This would be the kamikaze. The kamikaze, or divine wind, was a suicide tactic first used by the aerial forces of the Imperial Japanese military in the fall of 1944. And although pilots had purposefully crashed into enemy targets many times before, this was the first time that they were used in an official unit as an organized tactic. These attacks would go on to not inflict enough damage to sway the momentum in the Pacific, but they did damage hundreds of American ships and have quite a psychological effect on the sailors of the US Navy. And even though the anti-aircraft guns of the American warships would shoot down many of these attacking planes, the few that did get through the flak and machine gun fire would often have lethal results. When these Japanese pilots were able to hit their targets, the aircraft were loaded so heavily with explosives and bombs that the damage that they did to the warships was significant. As the war went on, the kamikaze would see its most prolific use at the Battle of Okinawa, with over 1,000 Japanese suicide aircraft attempting to crash into the American fleet, floating off the coast in support of the ground forces. American fighters and naval gunners would shoot down many of the kamikazes, but a significant number would crash into their targets. At the end of the battle in June of 1945, more than 200 US Navy ships had taken damage from the attacks, with thousands of sailors killed. But in the weeks that came after the Battle of Okinawa had officially ended, just as many of the Japanese forces refused to give up on the ground, many Japanese pilots also refused to accept defeat. These mindsets resulted in many courageous, but often hopeless desperation attacks against the US fleet still floating off the coast. On July 28th of 1945, one of these final bold attacks would take place. According to most sources, this was actually the last successful kamikaze attack of the war. But in many ways, it would differ vastly from many of the earlier attacks in the summer. As the Japanese Kamikaze Corps was put into full-time action, more than 1,000 Japanese pilots were sent to their death. But often forgotten is that in addition to this loss of life, this also began to drain another valuable resource: aircraft. As the Battle of Okinawa was coming to an end, the Japanese were running out of planes. After all, with every kamikaze mission, none of the planes ever came back, and so aircraft were exhausted very quickly using this strategy. So by the end of the battle, some of the aircraft that were sent up for these kamikaze attacks were outdated biplanes from the 1930s. And while these aircraft did have serious disadvantages and were easy targets for American fighters, they did have one forgotten advantage that allowed them to sometimes be successful in these kamikaze attacks. Because of the state of the Imperial Japanese air and naval forces at this time, when a kamikaze pilot was ready to make this great sacrifice, they were forced to send them up in whatever planes they still had available. By July 28th of 1945, the only airworthy machines still available in the area were vintage Yokosuka KY-5 biplanes, known to the Allies as the Willow. This outdated plane was used by the Imperial Japanese Navy exclusively as a trainer. It was made completely of fabric and wood, and when it was armed, only had one single machine gun firing forward. By any standard, it was a completely outmatched aircraft by the start of World War II, and by 1945 was completely obsolete in every possible feature. To put into perspective just how bad of a plane this was to fly into a combat zone, every single Willow of the Imperial Navy was painted orange for visibility since they were only planned to be used as trainers. So not only were these pilots going up in a slow and vulnerable plane with nearly no armament, but they were also painted in a manner that made them a perfect target. But despite these nearly impossible odds, on the evening of July 28th, 5 courageous Japanese pilots of the Kamikaze Corps took to the air from the small island of Miyakojima. Their goal in this final mission was to try and deal as much damage as possible to the American warships in their outdated planes that were loaded to the brim with explosives and bombs. Their target for this mission would be Task Force 54, an armada of American warships covering Okinawa. This group included a significant number of American battleships and destroyers that were battle-hardened and had crews of seasoned veterans. One of these many ships sailing in this force was the USS Callahan, a Fletcher-class destroyer. Interestingly, this destroyer was named in honor of U.S. Navy Admiral Daniel Callahan, a commander who was killed when an enemy shell struck the bridge of his ship in 1942 at Guadalcanal. And if this name sounds familiar, it may be because in the famous story about the kamikaze buried at sea by the US Navy, it was his brother, Captain William Callahan, commander of the USS Missouri, that ordered the burial of the Japanese pilot. By this time, in July of 1945, the USS Callahan had served her namesake well and had performed valiantly in multiple battles across the Pacific. She had survived some of the toughest fighting seen at this time, and her crew was very experienced. In the previous weeks, the Callahan had witnessed multiple ships nearby taking direct hits from kamikazes, but she had been able to fend off all of the attacks aimed at her, claiming more than 10 Japanese planes shot down by this point, painting the clear picture that her gunners were highly skilled. Furthermore, in a tragic coincidence, her crew had actually just finished celebrating. A few hours earlier in that day, the crew of the USS Callahan had just found out that they were going home. After one more night patrol, she was assigned to turn back to the States because she was finally being relieved. This was no doubt a happy time for the sailors on the Callahan. But little did they know that an enemy was already on the way to attack them and would give them more trouble than she had ever seen. As the sun set over the Pacific and darkness began to fall, an alert went out over the radio. Japanese planes have been spotted. Immediately, the alarm for combat stations was sounded on the Callahan, and the men of Task Force 54 prepared to fight. In a few minutes, planes began to appear in the sky. The guns across the task force opened fire and filled the sky with flak and tracers. Soon, most of the Japanese Willow planes take hits and go down, their exposed pilots likely killed in the air before they could even make it close to their targets. But one of these biplanes attempted to make a run on the USS Callahan, screaming down in its suicidal run. The hardened gunners on the ship defended well, and after taking substantial fire, the attacking Japanese plane turned away and was driven off. Or so they thought. This assessment was actually incorrect. The Japanese plane, which had been driven off of its first attack, was still alive and still intent on its mission. And incredibly, its outdated and weak design was actually now helping it survive. One of the key weaknesses of the primary Japanese aircraft, the A6M20, was that it lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. So oftentimes, whenever the Zero took substantial damage, it simply burst into flames once the fuel was ignited. This can be seen from much of the historic footage that we have from World War II. The Japanese biplanes, however, did not have fuel tanks in the wings, so despite the fact that they had to fly much slower and at lower altitudes, they were often able to withstand things like machine gun fire better than the Zero. In addition, one of the primary threats to Japanese kamikazes was the anti-aircraft fire from the Navy ships. These filled the skies and made it nearly impossible for these aircraft to make it to their targets. However, ironically, as they were using a biplane in some of these desperation missions, this caused some of the American ammunition to not work properly. Many of the Navy's proximity fuses did not work quite as well against such a lightly constructed plane, and many of the shells designed to explode upon impact simply went directly through the fabric and wood, allowing the plane to carry on, right towards her target. With holes throughout the fabric of the plane, the Japanese Kamikaze began a second run on the Callahan. And now, as it did this, another weak feature of the aircraft yet again worked in the favor of the Kamikaze. Because it was flying so slow, the biplane was able to remain at an extremely low altitude and was very difficult for the gunners to detect in the darkness of the evening. The biplane closed in, mostly undetected and quietly, and miraculously made it to the ship. The wood and fabric disintegrate into the side of the USS Callahan and break apart, doing very little damage. But one of her small bombs underneath the plane would find home. This small explosive penetrated into the engine room, causing flooding below decks. Because of this, soon a small fire was started due to the flooding, and anti-aircraft ammunition nearby was ignited, causing explosions within the ship. When this began to occur, none of the other ships were able to assist the destroyer. Unable to get help, within 2 hours the fires raged and the USS Callahan sank, with 47 of her sailors being killed. The rest would be picked up by the nearby ships of Task Force 54. In a nearly hopeless attack, weeks after the Battle of Okinawa had already ended, the last major casualty of the conflict was inflicted on the American fleet. The US Navy had lost a mighty destroyer, and the Japanese Navy had traded only 5 wood and fabric trainers. It was a truly miraculous feat, and the Japanese kamikaze pilots had defied the odds. Taking place at the end of July, this would be the last successful kamikaze attack of the war, and the very last destroyer sunk in World War II. In the following days, the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, and the war would end. But even to the last man and the last plane, the Japanese had fought, even when the odds were next to impossible. Don't forget to download War Thunder for free today at the link below to join the most immersive and detailed vehicle combat game around, and add me as a friend so that you can fly with me. Please comment what story I should cover next, and please consider subscribing.